30 Years of Watchtower Slave, Chapter 14, entitled Service in New York. Up to this point, the author had been talking about experiences that happened in Germany and how it related to the Watchtower Society in the late 20s and early 30s. And now he's going to bring us some of his personal experiences to date in the narrative. So the first subheading is called A Case History. So by 1935, he was holding a pioneer assignment in a New York State county, and he was having some success there. Meanwhile, it became quite evident to the congregation there that the company's servant was a man of character, as he says. He was an old-time Bible student who wasn't bowing down to the Watchtower Society. In other words, he was skating on thin ice. One day there appeared on the scene an elderly brother who was connected to the Watchtower Society's service department. And soon enough, this special brother began getting Watchtower Society instructions over the head of the company servants. And it didn't take long for the members of the congregation to realize who was really in charge. In the meantime, those in the congregation had received orders from the headquarters to cooperate fully with this man. So the company servant, or as we would call today, the coordinator to the body of elders, or as it used to be called, I think it was the presiding overseer. I think most of you are familiar with that term. The company servant was basically forced to take a back seat. And his disfavor with the society became quite evident. But the regular rank and file publishers rallied around the other brothers and not this company's servant. So finally he had enough and he resigned. In his place was a member of the author's family who was appointed as the company servant. This new company servant, family member to the author, was a very staunch and subservient society boy. And of course, this technique was used and perfected to get rid of those that they didn't want, or those who weren't as loyal as other society boys were. The next subheading is entitled Far From Infallible. The following year, 1936, he received a call to come to Bethel. And the purpose was to ask him to stay in New York to become the company servant for a congregation in Manhattan. So he ended up accepting this offer. But the society took things to mean that he was willing to give up his personal plans for theirs, for the sake of putting kingdom interests first. So that was the last thing he wanted. So he tried to wiggle out of this assignment as fast as he could. He goes on to talk about how the society made many serious and often evident errors in the selection of personnel. Many of these errors were procedural. Case in point was, while he was the company servant there in Manhattan, he received from the legal desk of the society a form letter addressed to all company servants. So again, a letter addressed only to the company servants, kind of like the body of elders receive letters today. It designated a day 4 weeks ahead of time in which all publishers were to nail a certain attack and proclamation against religion on all the doors of the churches in their territories. When the author read it, he didn't really agree with it, and I wouldn't have either myself. It just didn't sound right to him, and it doesn't sound right to me. I mean, they're not Martin Luther. we know Martin Luther almost died for what he did. And so that's basically how the author was comparing the thing. So he ended up talking to a lawyer, and he pointed out that the pamphlet would not draw legal action if it was distributed by hand. But in each instance where it was nailed to the church door, they would receive nationwide litigation. And so when the author learned about the consequences of this proposal, he called the judge and told him what was going on, what he found out. And so the next day he received another letter from the society saying that this had been canceled. I wish that this had not been canceled, just to see what would happen if they actually went and nailed this letter to the church's doors like Martin Luther. So now that the locally appointed elders had completely disappeared and in their place had become representatives of the society, these new company servants, these newly appointed company servants, as the author mentions, that they had no Christian background. To them, they were the products of a class, and now they were the official appointees of the faithful and wise servants. So individual publishers mattered very little to them. The meetings now were designed to make these classes better publishers. But as for being better Christians, that never really entered into the picture. We kind of see that today still with the Theocratic Ministry School, and it's always about how to place magazines, how to make return visits, how to conduct Bible studies. It's never how to be a better person, a better Christian, or very little whenever it is presented. The next subheading is entitled, My Heart is Not in It. So by the summer of 36, he was called into the service department and asked to stay in the city to become a unit servant of Manhattan. Now, I believe, don't hold my words, that a unit servant would be somewhat like a circuit or district overseer. But he was very hesitant about accepting this assignment. He mentions that when he had left the Germany Magdeburg Bethel behind, that he was not able to recapture his individual status as a Christian. But he mentions that it had become plain to him why this happened. It's because he stopped studying God's Word as the basic truth, but avidly kept on reading Watchtower material. Watchtower publication, books, booklets, pamphlets, tracts, brochures, all of that stuff. So his mind was filled with Watchtower organizational mindedness rather than being able to think for himself. He mentions that his Christian individuality would assert itself in qualms of conscience. That kind of sounds familiar to us. Crisis of conscience. But anyways, he said that this would only happen every so often. It was bothered. His conscience was bothered, but he was so busy in doing organizational matters that it gave him very little time to really think about what his conscience was telling him. So upon receiving an offer to remain in New York as this circuit or district overseer, he accepted because it coincided with his personal desire to stay in New York rather than move anywhere else. So he accepted. He mentions this, and it's kind of interesting. He says, if you can gradually assume an attitude of objectivity and work and think of the theocracy in a detached and increasingly superficial way, it is obvious that the mark of the beast will gradually relinquish its hold on your soul. Instead of a permanent mark, it will be kind of like a tattoo through which a simple operation, maybe a laser removal operation, although painful, can be removed at will in the future. Basically, if you want to get rid of Watchtower thinking, you got to get yourself out of there. You got to stop reading that crap and stop indoctrinating yourself. The next subheading is a ringside seat. So now that he was still able to be close to the headquarters, he was able to watch from a ringside seat what was transpiring in the Watchtower organization. And as before, as he saw in Germany, well, the same things were happening here in the United States. And he said he had a sense of sheer futility, like he couldn't do anything about it. He was watching the organization in action, and nothing could be done to stop it. The next subheading is I get out of line. So since he was able to kind of relate to what was already done in Germany, he could anticipate what the organization was going to do next. And this got him in trouble on several occasions because the brothers thought that he was running ahead and needed to wait on the lead of the organization. He said sometimes that he erred deliberately in order to see if they were following this pattern or not. In 1937, he received a special delivered letter from the judge's office. Oh boy. The next subheading is it was torture. So he says all during this time he could see what was going on, and he had sensations of frightened claustrophobia. And it was like a nightmare, seeing the danger and wanting to flee, but his legs weren't able to move him. He couldn't make his escape, but neither could the danger catch up with him. So all this worked against a possible escape of the Watchtower. He wasn't reading the Bible or studying it with an open mind or an unprejudiced mind, but through the Watchtower lenses, and that's kind of how all of us witnesses were at one time or another. So this prevented him from escaping. But eventually, 18 years later, after accepting this assignment from the headquarters, he was able to escape the society. The next subheading is entitled Called to Bethel. So in June of 1937, he was finally able to meet with the judge after he had summoned him. He mentioned that he was scared and afraid of what was going on, or what was supposed to happen. So eventually he found himself before the judge. He was in the same position there that he had been in Berlin, where he had been called to the room of the director of the branch office there in Germany and asked to come help the brothers there. And the same thing was happening. Another proposition was made to him, but little did he know that his acceptance to this would lead to an 18-year period of torture and torment. So the next subheading is entitled Life at Bethel. Well, he soon discovered that things were the same as they were in Germany. They were patterning themselves in the same manner. Meal times were the same. They read their daily manna, which today is known as examining the scriptures daily. And by the time everything was over, they only had 20 to 30 minutes to eat breakfast, which isn't a lot of time. I've only served in Bethel as a temporary worker a few times, and I can attest that mornings are just nuts. I couldn't do that longer than the week or two that I had temporarily volunteered there. But Bethel life was patterned as it was in Germany. The next subheading is entitled Spies Everywhere. So just as everything else was being patterned like the Germany branch, the same is true of the spy system. So he had to tread lightly, Eventually, he found out who some spies were. By accident, he found out some because when he would say something, the very next day he would get pulled into the office of an overseer and they would have a talk about what he said. So he was able to find out who the spies were, and really they kind of rewarded spies for ratting on people. That's what cults do. He was under surveillance even when he left for personal reasons to go visit his father. Someone from Bethel would go ahead of him and visit his father's congregation to make sure that he was there. So things kind of got out of hand after he asked the judge to be relieved of his assignment. They asked him to stay until the convention, which was right around the corner. But to his amazement, he was allowed to leave in good standing after the convention was over. This was in August of 38. But he did receive a new assignment, and that was to become an exactor or zone servant of northeastern Ohio and northwestern Pennsylvania. Upon receiving this assignment, he received specific instructions and was told about the failure of companies in this area. So it was explained to him what was expected of him. I'm guessing he had to improve the numbers there of the congregations in that area. So this is going to end this chapter, and please stay tuned for the next. Thank you for taking time to watch and listen to this presentation. Post your comments, like and share this video, subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for the next chapter.